Be yourself all the time. Whether it's a certain month, that doesn't matter.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. In honor of Pride Month, Talking About Kids is devoting its June episodes to LGBT plus issues. This first installment is how understanding history can help LGBT plus youth. And my guest is the hip historian Marshall Shore. Marshall is known throughout the southwestern United States and beyond for excavating videos, news stories, and other lost artifacts from the distant and not so distant past, and using them to make history come alive in engaging events. Along the way, Marshall has helped right some past wrongs that were done to LGBT plus Americans, and he has brought attention to both their contributions and the hardships they faced. In doing so, Marshall has comforted and inspired LGBT plus youth, and he has advice for how you can do the same. This podcast is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
So I moved to Arizona from New York City about 25 years ago. And people kept saying, oh, there's no history here. So I knew that wasn't true. I was working in a library in South Phoenix where there was a rich oral tradition of the community. So I started learning about Arizona through stories. And then I was like, well, what are the LGBTQ histories? And people said, oh, we tear down everything, so there really is no history. And I knew that wasn't true because there were so many amazing stories. But I happened to be on a vacation in Provincetown and flipping through one of those vintage muscle magazines from the 50s and came across an ad of an artist who was doing mermaid and merwomen art in the 50s. And he was hailing from Phoenix, Arizona. And I was like,
which is the merman and mermaid capital of the world, right? They're a completely landlocked, barren desert. That's where you go to be inspired for that kind of art. So you see this article on this artist doing work in mermaids and mermen. Please continue.
And so I was like, oh my gosh, here's proof that there is LGBT history in Phoenix, because he was also not just doing that, but half-naked cowboys. And so he was the art director for a lot of those 50s muscle magazines. And he was doing a lot of that from right here. So it gave me concrete proof that indeed something happened here that people weren't aware of. And how do we make that? How do we change that?
And what do you think hearing these stories means to people, and in particular to kids? I guess I'm asking, why is it important that we uncover these unknown histories?
Because so many times, when you're in this process of trying to figure out who you are, where you fit into the world, you think you're alone. And finding folks that confirm that you indeed are not alone. There have been people that have been living in a variety of ways for centuries and have left their mark for you to see. Now, you may not know what you're seeing, but they've left it there for you.
In last year, when I addressed some of these issues during Pride Month, I had a rather lively exchange with a listener about a trans youth. And in particular, one of the things that this person said, and it's something that you actually hear a lot in people who are, from people who are concerned about gender affirming care and in particular, how we treat trans youth. And he says, well, these trans youth, that never happened before. We never used to have trans people, and now all of a sudden, it's a fad, right? And I'm sure you've heard this too, but you've uncovered some things about some historical figures that really kind of goes far to refute that.
Right. I think a case in point is Nikolai DeRay,
Yeah.
a Russian gender pioneer who basically moves from Russia to Chicago, gets himself a cushy government job, and two wives, one divorce, and tuberculosis. And back in the turn of the century, back in the turn of the
Right.
1900s, people actually came to Arizona for not just the dry air, but the clean air. And that's
Right.
what he did. And it didn't go well. He survived for a few months, but as they were ready for burial, they discovered that he had been born a woman.
Mm.
And so, it was like at that point, I started tracking down his story and found his burial site. He was not given a headstone, even though he was fairly well off and would have been able to afford a headstone. And I assumed that that is a slam against trying to erase his story. And so we
Well,
actually were able to raise funds and got him a
yeah.
headstone.
But if I recall correctly, because I read about this at the time that you were doing this investigation, um, was Nikolai buried as a woman or was he buried as a man?
So he was buried in a dress.
Mm.
And so that was the thing. I mean, and it was headline news across the globe from southern Arizona to Australia, above the fold front page for quite a while. This and people were in shock that, oh, we knew this guy and
Right.
how did he dupe us? Things like that.
Well, and also, if I'm not mistaken, you uncovered and reported that, his widow absolutely affirmed his identity, correct?
Correct. To the point where, oddly enough, at one point the body was exhumed
Oh, wow.
to confirm that indeed it was Nikolai and that Nikolai had been born a woman. Um,
Mm.
Probably one of the reasons, other than he was leading his authentic life, but he also came with money, and
Right.
that he, in his will he left his money to his wife. And so when it was discovered that he was a woman, the court said, well, you can't marry another woman, so therefore your money goes back to your family, who he was estranged from.
Oh, wow.
So
Well,
it
and
was a diss at every turn.
did you ever discover in this anything from his ex-wife? Because you would think, knowing a little bit that I do, stories of divorce, you'd think if somebody had an axe to grind against poor Nikolai, it might be his ex.
And there's been mention of her, but she never divulged the secret. He actually had an agreement with his current wife that said basically when he was when he was to have when he was to have been readied for burial, that
Hmm.
she was the one to do it.
Okay.
And he was here in Phoenix, she was in Chicago, and so they went ahead and did it. And that's how his secret was discovered.
You know, when I read that story before, when you were doing this, it just filled me with a tremendous amount of sadness because it seemed like nobody that knew that, well, let me say in the positive way, everybody that knew Nikolai personally liked the guy and they embraced his identity, his authentic self. And it was only in this fluke of burial that people started to get hurt by it. And and then the other thing though that I was so excited about, I read, and you worked with a friend of ours, Ace Walton, to get that headstone done. Did you get any? Was there any pushback about having that headstone placed over the unmarked grave?
No, actually, it was interesting. I called the cemetery and I pretty much just cold called them. And they were like, well, does he have any family? And I'm like, he has no blood relatives.
Yeah.
And if he did, we would have had to have tracked them down, gotten the
Okay.
okay to place the headstone. And then they're like, well, are you family? How are you connected? And once I started talking about the story, the woman was like, yes, we will definitely do this.
Well,
And of that era, it was not unusual. I was listening to a podcast a couple of months ago, and in New York City, there was a gentleman by the name of Murray Hill who was
hmm,
leading his authentic life. When he passed away, he was buried with no headstone around the same era. So it was kind of a way, again, to remove them from history.
right. As have happened to so many different people for so many different reasons for millennia, right?
And it's like, and so Nikolai would have been Anglo, but being here in Arizona in the Southwest, we have an inordinate amount of indigenous history.
Mm,
And the
right.
term Two Spirit, which is, I think, about 20 years old now, basically talks about a prior way of life where people were basically exalted for living outside of their gender.
Right.
And so it's like we have a history here in Arizona of that.
Yeah, there's a two spirit gathering in Arizona that's been going on for a very long time. A conference. I've had the pleasure of being at it before, but I was surprised the first time I went. How long it had been going on. I don't know the exact history, but it was impressive.
Yeah, I mean, and they've been holding a Two Spirit powwow for several years, and it's getting bigger and bigger every year.
So when you were able to successfully kind of bring the story of Nikolai back into our collective conscious and were able to get him this headstone, did anybody reach out to you after these stories were in the news about your work and shared what it meant to them?
So even to do the headstone, I didn't work in solitude. I worked with Trans Spectrum of Arizona, as
Mm,
well as the Trans Digital Archive, the Louise Lawrence Archive out of San Francisco. So that way, it wasn't just me doing this. And yeah, what's been incredible is I don't necessarily tell people exactly where the burial is, where the site
okay.
is. But what I'll do, Greenwood Cemetery in Phoenix. And so I actually have had people flag me down and show me a photo. I had one woman flag me down at a pride event and say, look at this photo. Her and a group
Mm.
of about 5 or 6 friends had found the headstone and took a photo of themselves having laid fresh flowers right in front of it.
Yeah, I mean, because I have to imagine that there are other people, even people outside the LGBT plus community that really feel that sense of injustice that drove you in this.
Well, and it's interesting when you start talking about just history. I've got a presentation coming up this weekend on June 1st at a library. The librarian just said that they've been getting pushback from the community, and so there will be police at the presentation.
Yeah, the what's happening in libraries is across the country is crazy. I mean, to the extent that people are protesting and asking libraries to ban books that they don't even carry. So like it's outstanding. In what is your talk going to be on that it's drawing some
LGBTQ
potential?
history of Arizona. So, talking about like the fact that the trans flag was designed right here in Phoenix, Arizona by a Navy veteran.
Can you explain a little bit more about that, please?
So Monica Helms, who is now living in Atlanta with her wife. So in 1999, she had been talking to some folks and they said, maybe it's time for a trans flag. And so
Right.
she set about designing it. Now, before that ever happened, she was on a submarine in the Navy.
Wow.
And so she is very much a trans activist. There is a book about her that she wrote, More Than Just the Flag. And so that original flag that she created is sitting in the Smithsonian Museum right now.
There's another part of the work that you've been able to do, and um, you've also documented some of, and I don't exactly know how to characterize this, and I'm actually not even comfortable using the words that were used to describe it. But you've gone and done tours, and you've even created landmark plaques
Mhm.
around the active gay lifestyle in Phoenix, and where that took place and why. Why did you? First of all, tell us about that, and then what motivated that?
So typically, it's like when you're doing history of things, you want to find buildings. And
Mm,
so often, when you're talking a marginalized community, the buildings were not the best maintained and often are not there. And so the 307 had been in location for almost 50 years and had quite a history. And it was suddenly now purchased, going to be torn down for an apartment complex. And so we started gathering information. We were trying to save it. We got into the process too late. The building had already been designed. And the builder, actually, one of the builder's sons was gay. And
mm,
to make amends, was like, well, we said, well, what about a plaque? Now, when we started putting together the idea of a plaque, our idea was actually have it on the building so it'd be easy to see.
right.
And they kept stressing it needs to be in the sidewalk, and they would not budge on that. And so we had it installed into the sidewalk. Soon after that, they actually sold the building. And I'm assuming they knew what their plans were and they didn't want it attached to the side of the building because it would have been easy to remove. Now that
Ah,
it's in the sidewalk, it would be much more difficult and awkward to remove it and replace it. But we did do a celebration of that building by the apartment complex actually let us have rooftop access. So we had Greg Stanton, who at that point was mayor,
right.
Phoenix Pride, a variety of drag queens who had performed actually in the space back in the 80s to present. And so it was really a celebration of bringing folks together and sharing that
And
history.
yeah, because this is also kind of the I don't know if it's the opposite side of this coin that is your work, but showing people, and this we're talking about a bar in Central Phoenix that, as you already pointed out, not in a great location, was never in a great location. What do you think the value of bringing to and demonstrating to young people what the gay lifestyle used to entail? How do you think that helps them today?
Well, it's interesting getting ready with the art museum here in Phoenix, getting ready to do a presentation on LGBTQ arts.
Mm,
And one of the issues is an artist gay or not? If you know them socially, you might know that about them. But if you read their professional press, sometimes you know, sometimes you don't. And
right.
so when you talk artists like Keith Haring, who did some work here that I think found fundamentally changed art in Arizona. You also
Mm.
have folks like Andy Warhol who was here and made a movie. And so you've got these connections, but then you've got a statue at the Central and Roosevelt light rail stop that was done by a gay man. And no one, it's like, and when I brought that up about Roosevelt Row, even the businesses that are there celebrating the gay history along Roosevelt, they were like, oh, we didn't know that. And so that's been an interesting thing of artists outing themselves or not outing themselves.
Right.
Sometimes, I mean, one of my favorite stories is a woman named Rusty Warren, who we've all benefited from. She was a classically trained pianist in the 50s, tried to find a job. The only place she could find was a little piano bar here in Phoenix. And so she has 15 albums to her credit. Half of those have gone gold, and her hit song was called Knockers Up. And so, because of that song, the Library of Congress now bills her as the birth mother of the sexual revolution for stuff she was doing right here in Phoenix.
Crazy.
And in order, and it's like, and she was very much a lesbian, very out, but because of the era and how she made her money, it wasn't widely known. And
Hmm.
even when I reached out to her in, like, I'll say like 2010, we started chatting via email. And she's like, well, what is your interest in my music? And I was like, well, I'm really interested in your story as an out lesbian in the 50s. And that almost derailed the whole friendship conversation, because it was like, well,
Interesting.
with what is your intent? And so once we started talking again, and she realized that it was only going to be for good, that I wasn't trying to slander her, or her biggest fear was that people she knew that weren't out would be outed, guilt by association.
Right. I mean, it's just knowing that that is, such a real and living fear of older generations of LGBT individuals is in and of itself, I think, illustrative of maybe how far we've come and of things that we need young people to hear and learn about. And
Right.
and this is where I come to this next point, because if you're a parent, or you're a teacher, or you're a direct service provider, you're working with kids in an after school program, how would you recommend that they bring in more of these histories for the LGBTQ plus youth in their programs or in their home?
Well, what I tend to do is focus on a lot of marginalized stories. So, just like Black people, gay people, Hispanic people, Indigenous, we're around 365 days a year. And
Mm.
so, trying to tell those stories year round, so that it's not just, okay, where's where we talk about it, but starting to just have that conversation, and
Right.
that be yourself all the time. Whether it's a certain month, that doesn't matter. And I mean, as we're getting ready for Juneteenth as well,
Mm.
I try to tell stories in unique ways. Um, right now, working on the story of Charles Harrison, who designed the Viewmaster that we all grew up with. And so he was a
Yeah.
graduate of Carver High School in South Phoenix.
Whoa. Okay.
And
Still
so,
standing. Yeah.
yeah, so that building is still there, has a great group now running it. And so one of the things I did was, like, well, how do we tell this story? So I actually created a Viewmaster reel that tells Charles Harrison's story. So now you can learn his story, his history, through his own device.
Very cool.
And what
Yeah.
I
And
love
for the
and doing something
yeah.
like that, which was great, was because folks like you and I, of a certain age, go, oh my gosh, I remember playing with that as a kid. And then I had kids picking up going, well, what is this? And they're like, whoa, look at that. It's 3D. So
Yeah.
engaging audiences in different ways, to look at history and to start questioning. Because sometimes you know the history
So,
behind things, sometimes you don't.
well, but I also like what you said about, well, two things that I want to make sure that the listeners heard you say. One is making it an everyday thing, where you talk about these histories not just during, Pride Month, as we're in right now, or not just at particular landmark events. But I also like your recommendation about looking at figures that are less known. I think that, I suspect that most youth today know about the biggest cultural icons that might be gay or trans. But your recommendation is to find those figures who we know and we know what they've done, but we might not know about their identity or their orientation. And does, in your opinion, does that seem to even kind of normalize orientation and identity more than just focusing on these cultural icons?
I would say yes, because they come from every walk of life. I
Mm,
mean, you have Monica Helms, who was a Navy vet who designed a trans flag.
right,
And one person went on and now has created a symbol that is seen globally as a safety blanket for so many folks, as a shield. And so,
right.
being that any one person has that strength.
Who is in your audience when you do these events? I mean, besides me when I'm in Arizona, who else is in your audience going to your events?
It depends on the location. You know, it's interesting because I wind up with older folks
Mm,
at most of my presentations. Um, it's interesting. I did a program on gay history a couple of years ago out in Mesa, and there were like two youth sitting far apart from each other. So I don't know if they knew each other. And there was one young person that was sitting in the very back that, as soon as I was done, literally ran out of the room.
mm,
And I was just so happy that they were there. I
right.
had the luck, several years ago, had friends. They had a new son who is now identifying as their son in Flagstaff. And so I was up there for an event, went to go have a cup of coffee. Then I figured, 20 minutes, we'll just kind of chit chat. It wound up into this kind of 4 hour lesson on Arizona LGBTQ history. And Lance was like,
Mm,
how did I not know that my state had this amazing history?
right.
So that's also given me that charge of how do we reach those. And that's why I'm excited to be doing an event at the Phoenix Art Museum. Being able to this summer, I'm around at least 6, if not 7, different locations doing LGBTQ history, specifically in Arizona, not those places like San Francisco, LA, New York, but things that were right here.
Well, and I want to point out for my listeners who are outside of Arizona, just so you know, most of the time when you go to see Marshall Shore present, it's just on history. If that history intersects with issues related to LGBT plus, then it does, and you bring that up. But you're primarily a historian, and these other issues come to the forefront because they're there and nobody's talking about them. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to explain your audience, because when I've been to your events, it is everybody. If you're interested in the community in which you're living, you're going to hear you talk about it. And like you said, you bring out the history of anybody who isn't mentioned but contributed and should be mentioned.
And for me, that's really the fun of it, is finding these not headline characters, but these amazing stories like Charles Harrison, that, if you, depending on what circle you run in, he's a well-known name, but not in every circle.
Right. Right.
I just did an event, and so we were talking about the railroads in Arizona and about how um, in Flagstaff there is a statue of a white man putting in railroad tracks. And it's like, there were lots of communities that were involved in that. And one of the artists I was talking to is like, well, what is an up? How do you convey that? I said, my favorite story is the story of the chimichanga. And it's a deep fried burrito. So back when they were installing railroad tracks, they brought in all these Chinese guys to come lay tracks. And they were marrying into Hispanic families. And so the Chinese guy saw a burrito, which looks like a really big egg roll. And so with an egg roll, you fry it. And so that's what they did, creating the chimichanga. So the chimichanga history goes back to railroad history. And so I always try to find, I would say, uplifting ways. I mean, there are so many ways that could be negative that would tell that story, but how would we uplift that story and make it more positive? And
Right.
because we know there was lots of segregation going on at so many levels for so
Right.
many folks. But those stories of survival, those stories of fortitude, of perseverance.
Right. Well, and I need to thank you because you just even with the chimichanga story there, that's Arizona's official state food.
Actually, it's not.
And
We actually never
oh,
did. They didn't say yes to it. Um,
oh, I know that it
so
was raised. They passed some
and in
committees and
2012, you had a local restaurant here who tried to get it as a state food. El
right.
Charo was like, well, wait a minute. We were here before you doing the chimichanga, so we created it. And we still do not have a state food. There are also people who thought it should have been the Navajo taco.
Okay. But
So,
the
which has its
important thing
own.
is, right, neither of those dishes is in line with some of the white xenophobia that has been making headlines for Arizona over the last several years. It goes back to a history of the state that is far richer and far more inclusive that you know and that I know.
And so, even when I was doing Arizona Jersey Happy Hour, it was like I would be posting things on Facebook about how we're going to be talking about Black history. And I
Right.
would get face groups saying, oh, we had to ban some of our members because they started going off on the fact that you were going to be talking about Black history.
Hmm.
And then, so I'm like, there's so many slices and prisms to look at history through.
Well, I think that is a wonderful way to wrap this up. Marshall, I want to thank you so much again for everything you do. I've been a fan of yours for a very long time. And so I'm just really thrilled that you've been able to make the time to be on Talking About Kids.
Thank you so much, and anytime, Brad.
That was Marshall Shore. For more information about Marshall and how you can bring him to your community, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.